what I'd like to do is really bring you back a little bit and give you some history and tell you some of the good news, I think, about what's happening in chemical weapons. Just as we're almost close to a universal nuclear test ban, which would be a wonderful step forward for public health and sustainability and global security, we're within a hair's breadth, really, of being universal in the abolition of chemical weapons. So let me, yep, we're up on the screen. So let me move forward. I have a few PowerPoint slides, and I'll try to go through them quickly and not take up too much time, so we have plenty of time for Dr. Matthews and for discussion. The first point I want to make is that chemical weapons have been used pretty widely in the past, and to a deadly result. And many of you here probably know it's just about 101 years ago now. We commemorated the 100th anniversary for 102 years almost now. We commemorated the 100th anniversary of first major use of chemical weapons in World War I back in 1915, which took place in Ypres, Belgium, when the Germans first used, of all things, chlorine again. So we saw chlorine in 1915. We've seen chlorine again in 2014 and 15 in Syria. The picture here is a relatively famous picture. You see the troops with the eyes covered because of blindness from mustard agent use, a blister agent, and with their hands on the shoulders of the troops in front of them trying to keep their way. If any of you have ever gone to Ypres or Ypres, Belgium, you'll recognize this gate. This is called Menin Gate, of which there's a wonderful, very moving bagpipe experience and parade every evening, which has gone on for decades now, to commemorate all the dead from that horrible trench warfare battlefield in World War I. And you'll see back then in 1915, 5,700 canisters of chlorine were used by Germany to attack Allied forces, British and French and Belgian and North African and others there. In the end, 190,000 tons of chemical warfare were produced by Germany, France, Britain, the United States, and other warring parties. And throughout World War I, about 90,000 were killed. These estimates are very rough. No one really knows. It could be less, could be a lot more. And at least 1 million troops were injured by chemical weapons in World War I. But because of the horror of chemical warfare in World War I, the 1925 Geneva Protocol was signed by most countries, which prohibited the use, as you see on the slide there, of asphyxiating, poisonous, or other gases, and bacteriological methods of warfare. So you had a ban on use of both chemical and biological warfare, using disease as a warfare agent as well. But it didn't, as you see on the second bullet, it didn't stop research, development, test, and evaluation, RDT&E. And I have a quote here from U.S. President Roosevelt back in 1943. Use of such gas weapons has been outlawed by the general opinion of civilized mankind. Nevertheless, all the warring parties in the last century went forward and developed much more deadly and more sophisticated chemical weapons. So we've seen today, fortunately, chemical weapons have not been used on such a massive scale since World War I. We did see weapons used slightly in World War II. Some would argue more than slightly, I think, primarily by the Japanese in China. And we still face a cleanup of chemical weapons in China. It's one of the biggest issues in China today is the survey and unearthing and safe destruction of chemical warfare agents left by Japan after World War II. We saw them used quite widely, actually, in the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s. And if you followed that, you'll know that there were tens of thousands of Iranian troops and civilians killed by Saddam Hussein in that war. And today in Iran, there's a major non-governmental effort to promote and talk about the horrors of chemical warfare and to promote the needs of victims of chemical warfare, of which there are many still there. Saddam Hussein in Iraq attacked Kurdish northern Iraq and Halabja and surrounding towns and villages in 1988, killing thousands of his own citizens with agent back then. And then in the 91 Gulf War, of course, there was the threat of chemical warfare by Saddam Hussein, and the Allied forces destroyed, to a large extent, all of Saddam Hussein's chemical warfare stockpiles. And these were thrown into bunkers, 2 large bunkers in Fallujah outside of Baghdad that we're still dealing with today in the legacies left from that 91 war. 95, there was the Tokyo subway attack that some of you will remember by the Japanese terrorist group called Aum Shinrikyo. But they used sarin nerve agent, actually, just as we've seen in Syria in the last few years, and this week potentially. But it was so poorly done that, in fact, only I think about a dozen people were killed and 5,000 were injured, mostly in the panic that took place in the subway thereafter. But we have ongoing terrorist threats wanting to get nuclear, chemical, biological, radioactive materials, medical isotopes, fissile material for use in terrorist incidents still, and those threats continue to this day. And then, of course, what we hear this week, and I'll talk about more, is the Syrian civil war, in which we saw chemical weapons first used and reported in the news in December 2012, and right up to today. So this is 4.5 years later, still being used in Syria today. So the good news is that we have a chemical weapons convention. Just as we have a comprehensive test ban treaty, the Chemical Weapons Convention was negotiated all through the 1980s, and Dr. Matthews knows a lot about this because he participated in those negotiations. It was open for signature in 1993, very much pushed earlier by the Soviet Union and by the United States and the British and Canadians and Australia and other countries. Entered into force in 1997, and the US and Russia both ratified in 1997. The United States by the skin of its teeth under the Clinton administration before the entry into force in late April. And later this month, 2.5 weeks from now, we'll celebrate actually the 20th anniversary of the entry into force of the treaty in The Hague with Queen Beatrix and many other foreign dignitaries. Today it has 192 states parties, so it beats out the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, slightly anyway. We like to say it's the most universal treaty in the world and has more member states, more universality than any other multilateral organization except the United Nations itself, which has 196 states parties, if I'm correct. 4 countries are still outside the Chemical Weapons Convention, 4 United Nations recognized countries, and those are Egypt, Israel, North Korea, again, and South Sudan. And we'll talk about those a little bit later. And 8 countries have declared active chemical weapon stockpiles today. So those 8 countries are Russia, the United States, with 95% or more of you'll see the numbers up there, India, South Korea, Libya, Albania, Iraq, and Syria. And that amounts, depending on how you count, to 72,500 metric tons and probably somewhere around 10 million weapons. And the questions I always pose, as I've worked in this field now for 20, 25 years, the question I pose oftentimes is, why did we ever build so much of this stuff? The deadliest chemical substances on Earth, just built to kill massively in indiscriminate, inhumane ways. And the response I get oftentimes is, number one, it was the Cold War. Everyone was competing. The same story we hear about nuclear weapons as well. And number two, it was good jobs and good money. And people, didn't think about the larger environmental, public health, and security and safety questions beyond that. I came to this, some of you know, I think in the audience know, in really July 1994 when I helped lead the first U.S. on-site inspection of a Russian chemical weapons stockpile in Shucha, which is the easternmost stockpile of Russia today. Sits 3-hour flight east of Moscow on the steppes of Siberia, 2 hours from the nearest major city, just in the woods. And this is a picture you'll see from that inspection we did. And we went into this stockpile back in 1994, an American delegation with the Assistant Secretary of Defense and a couple of congressmen and the head of the U.S. Chemical Weapons Destruction Program, and we were hosted by the head of the Russian Chemical Weapons Stockpile Program. It was very clear both the Russians and Americans were deeply committed to abolishing their chemical weapons stockpiles back then. This is, over 20, 25 years ago now. But the Russian weapons were, as far as the eye could see, in really aging, obsolete, corrugated metal and wood, decrepit warehouses in this nondescript, forest with a little chain link fence around it. And I still remember asking the Russian commanding general how many weapons he actually had here. And remember, this is right on the Kazakhstan border, and this is slightly before all the terrorist activities started, but we were very concerned back then about terrorism and theft and diversion of just a couple of weapons, which could destroy, thousands of people in any major city of the world. And he said, "Oh, we don't keep count. 1,000 here or 1,000 there. It's all locked up behind locked doors." Well, those locked doors are like big swinging barn doors with a little bicycle padlock on the front of it. And when we came back from that inspection in 1994, the first thing we did was write a memo to the U.S. Secretary of Defense and others saying, we have to work with the Russians to get security on these sites. I mean, these are just ripe targets for diversion, theft, and terrorist activity. So it took 8 years at that point to get high security on these sites, which I was involved in as well. So by 2002, we were pretty secure that the sites were safe. But between 1994, when we were there, and 2002, who knows? But fortunately, we haven't seen any of these weapons used anywhere so far, so I think it's probably still pretty safe. Destruction in Russia. Just say it's been going on for 15 years now. Russians have been very committed. They have 7 sites. I've been to every one of them. Today, they've destroyed about 93, may even be 94% of the stockpile. There are 6 of their 7 stockpiles have been neutralized in a wet chemistry process. People always say, how can you destroy this stuff? And I always answer that, these weapons were never built to be destroyed. They were built to be used. And so the challenge for all of us back, 15, 20 years ago was, how do we get rid of this stuff safely so we don't kill anybody doing it? It's very difficult and very expensive and very dangerous to do. So the Russians chose neutralization, where you drain the weapon and mix it with hot water, and most often a caustic reagent like sodium hydroxide, and it neutralizes very well. Mustard agent itself neutralizes with just hot water. Very simple process. The Russians have spent over $10 billion to date on this process, so you can imagine how much this is robbing from, other needy budgets, including public health in Russia and other places. And they have about 3 years to go. They've projected 2020 they'll finish their formal 7 stockpile destruction program. The United States started much earlier, 1990, even before, 7 years before the treaty entered into force. So we began unilaterally destroying the stockpile long before, 12 years before the Russians even began. And we've destroyed about 90%, the United States so far, but somewhere over 25,600 metric tons. 7 of the 9 declared stockpiles in the United States have now been destroyed and are closed and in remediation process. We've spent well over $35 billion to date, and we have about 6 more years to go to finish the last 2 stockpiles. One in a place called Bluegrass, Kentucky, upwind of all the tobacco fields in Kentucky. And the funny story that's told in Kentucky is the tobacco farmers were very anxious to get rid of the stockpile and also to make sure it wasn't burned, that it was neutralized instead. They said, we don't want any toxicity in our tobacco, in Kentucky. So we always joke about the toxicity in Kentucky. You wouldn't want any VX nerve agent in your tobacco, And Pueblo, Colorado, which also refused incineration. The picture you see there on the right is an incinerator, and I'll come to that in discussion of technology, which has been one of the big challenges in the whole process. Other chemical weapon destruction processes, the picture you see there is the Albanian stockpile, and who knew Albania had a chemical weapon stockpile, right? Albania joined the convention in the 1990s, declared itself without a stockpile, and then in the early 2000s, they came back to the OPCW in The Hague and said, we think we found something that looks like a chemical weapon stockpile up in the mountains. And so there was this little shed outside of Tirana in the Albanian mountains, and the Americans, the Swiss, and the Germans, and a couple other scientific colleagues went up and looked at it, and sure enough, it was a stockpile with these sort of strange-looking barrels of mustard agent. And that turned out to be 16 metric tons, and Albania, with a lot of financial and technical support from the West, eventually destroyed it successfully in 2007. There's a lot more could be said on each of these programs. We just don't have the time today to talk about it. South Korea had about a 600 metric ton stockpile. The number is still secret. I don't know the exact number. South Koreans are very non-transparent about this, perhaps because of the politics, on the Korean Peninsula today. But they successfully destroyed their stockpile, verified by OPSW inspectors in 2008. India, also not transparent at all in this process. I had a 1,000-ton stockpile. Maybe this was because of the community sensitivities over the Bhopal disaster in 1984 or other reasons, but they successfully incinerated a mustard agent stockpile by 2009. Libya destroyed its stockpile by 2014. This was also a long story that I won't go into, but it's a fact that General Gaddafi, before he was killed, declared, I think, about 23 metric tons. And then after he was killed, the civil war took place. The new government came to the OPSW and said, oops, just like Albania, we think we found another stockpile. And Gaddafi had actually hidden a stockpile that was a weaponized mustard agent stockpile of about 500 artillery shells. And that's now been subsequently destroyed. There's also been about 800 tons of precursor chemicals, the preceding chemicals you can mix to make these deadly agents. And that was actually just destroyed about 5 months ago with a lot of European help, particularly from Denmark, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. And then Iraq has all the leftover detritus from 1991 that are in two very difficult, enormous bunkers the size of a soccer field, 3 stories high, one of them with an unexploded 1,000-pound U.S. bomb, laser-guided bomb from the 91 war. And that will take a long time to do it safely and not injure any of the workers. And then Syria has its 1,308 metric tons, which have now been destroyed as of 2015. But the Syrian story is a longer one that I'll mention briefly too. Syria, under pressure, as you recall, in 2013 from the Russians and the Americans, agreed to join as the 192nd state party to the Chemical Weapons Convention. Under the convention, it's obligated to abolish all of its chemical weapons and everything related to its chemical weapons, laboratories, chemicals, launch facilities, storage facilities, production facilities. And so there's been a long process since 2013 for the last 4.5 years, negotiating everything with Syria. And fortunately, by 2014, the middle of 2014, all of the chemical weapons were removed from Syria because it was too difficult to destroy in Syria with the civil war going on. And about half of them were destroyed on board the ship you see in the right-hand picture called the Cape Ray. And that was a very elaborate operation. They had to be, the chemicals had to be picked up by 2 other ships because Syria would not allow an American ship into Syrian waters. And then those ships moved to Italy, and the chemical weapons were transferred from those 2 ships to the American ship, which had a neutralization process on board. And everything was then destroyed either on the ship or shipped to the United States, Britain, Germany, and Finland, to their credit, for destruction, largely in incinerator processes in all 4 countries. The challenge with Syria, of course, is someone has continued to use chemical weapons and chemical agents in Syria ever since then. So although Syria has declared all of its weapons destroyed, and we could go into production facilities and storage facilities too. That's a complicated question as well. There's still widespread suspicions that Syria is using chlorine as a chemical weapon because that's an industrial chemical. Doesn't need to be declared under the Chemical Weapons Convention. And then this week, it's quite apparent to me that a nerve agent of some type, likely sarin agent, was used 2 days ago, and it was dropped from the air. And the only authority that has aircraft and helicopters is the Syrian military. So I'm quite convinced that this was an attack by the Syrian military for the first time since 2013 with nerve agents again, which means that either they've rebuilt some of their nerve agent laboratories and production facilities, or in fact, they've hidden stockpiles and are reusing it. And to me, it makes no sense at all, except as a terror weapon. Militarily, it makes no sense to use this, and I think we'll see. I'm sure there'll be some questions and discussion about this, but we'll see what happens in the next few weeks as more evidence comes out. So let me just try to go over a couple of key issues and then wrap up, given the time. Technology has been a big issue, and in the industrialized world, there's a lot of things we can do, but many people don't want us burning highly toxic waste of different types. And when you talk about things like sarin, soman, VX nerve agent, and burning it upwind of your schools and your families and your kids, not knowing perhaps what's coming out the smokestack, no matter what the thermal engineers will tell you, and I've had many long debates and discussions with our thermal engineer experts, you never quite know what's coming out the smokestack. And that's why in the environmental and public health communities, as a lot of you know, incineration of any type, whether it's medical waste, whether it's waste to energy, or whether it's chemical weapons, is really not a very happy topic to talk about. So in the United States and in Russia, there were big fights, and I don't need to overemphasize this, but that still go on to some extent over what the most appropriate, safe, and most cost-efficient technology is. And as a result of a lot of the work that we did in the United States and in Russia, the United States wound up with 5 incinerators at 5 sites, stockpile sites, because none of this stuff could be moved anywhere. It was too dangerous to move even off the military bases, and 4 neutralization sites. And the 2 remaining sites I mentioned, Colorado and Kentucky, will both be wet chemistry neutralization sites. And I can talk more about those technologies too if you want. Second stage is how you handle the toxic waste that comes out of it. The Russians have chosen bituminization. That's a long word I'd never heard of before, but it's basically mixing asphalt with the toxic substance and filling barrels for a toxic waste dump. And it's in some ways kind of kicking the ball down the road because you have enormous, tonnage of toxic asphalt, basically, that you've stored in sealed, retrievable bunkers. And the Russians first wanted to actually use this for roadbed and parking lots. And the United States did drip tests on animals, rats and mice and rabbits, actually to see whether it was carcinogenic, and it was highly carcinogenic, actually. So the Russians finally said, "Oh, all right, we'll fill barrels and put it in a storage waste site." But who knows what can happen 50 or 100 years from now with it. Sometimes incineration is used for a second stage too, and that tends to be a little more acceptable to communities when you're not actually burning live agent, but you're actually burning the toxic liquid remnants of it all. So oftentimes incineration is used. We oftentimes, or we're just in Kentucky beginning to test something called supercritical water oxidation, which is actually very interesting, a very high-tech, very expensive process, very high pressure, high temperature, but no flame. And that may work quite well as well. Another is money. All of this has cost billions of dollars. And the U.S. program, when it started, the United States estimated in its wisdom that it would cost $2 billion to destroy the 9 stockpiles we had. It's now probably well over $40 billion and growing still. And it's somewhere in the range of $4 to $5 billion or more per site, per stockpile. The Russians estimated about $2 billion as well, and theirs is well over $10 billion now. It's much less expensive due to the simplicity of their weapons. You see 5 of their weapons in the picture there, and those are 5 different caliber artillery shells filled with VX nerve agent. And that was a groundbreaking ceremony we held in Shuchi in Siberia in 2003. And the quick funny story about that is they brought these weapons up along with 2 large missile warheads filled with mini bombs with the VX nerve agent in it. And I said to the commanding officer, the Russian commanding officer, those are dummy training weapons, right? And we had 250 press from all over the world there and a lot of dignitaries and the like. And he said, no, we don't have training weapons at all. These are live weapons. And I said, well, how did you get them from the stockpile then, which is 20 kilometers away, up to this groundbreaking site where the destruction facility was built far away from the villages there? And he said, we just threw them in the back of a pickup truck. And these are, it's good Siberian roads. And so this was a bit of a shock in 2003 that, in fact, there was not more security and that these were live VX nerve agent in the middle of this ceremony in the middle of Siberia. Schedules and deadlines. The Chemical Weapons Convention has very specific schedules. I think the negotiators originally, as Bob Matthews knows well, never thought how difficult and expensive and complicated this would be, and politically contentious. So everyone has missed their deadlines. Everyone has pushed schedules back. The first estimate that the United States would finish was in 1994. And what's today? 2017. So we're 23 years after our first estimated completion date. The Russians first estimated 2004, and we're in 2017, so we're 13 years after the Russian deadline. It's been a very complicated, slow, persistent process. Community involvement. One of our efforts as Green Cross, as a neutral facilitator in these processes, has been to promote community involvement. These stockpiles were in very poor communities, raising issues of environmental and economic justice issues. And the two pictures you see here are the first public hearing we held in Russia, which sort of shocked Russian officials at the time. This was 1996, I believe. And we absolutely packed this little village in Siberia, and we had to broadcast it out into the town square. And the picture on the left you see there is one of the main roads of this village. So you can imagine this village called Shucha at the time thought this was sort of the gold pot at the end of the rainbow. Americans and Europeans coming in and building this billion-dollar facility, and they wanted their piece of the pie. They wanted some water, they wanted some gas, they wanted sewage, they wanted roads, they wanted some schools and swimming pools and a variety of community development issues. So this became a big issue that we've been actually very successful in facilitating and working with the Russians, Americans, the British, the Canadians, Australians, and New Zealanders, many others on. That's the town square in Shuchi, in the Kurgan Oblast. And this picture was taken in 1994 when we were there. I'm sure it's improved since then. I've been there probably 20 times, I think. Know that village very well. And then we've also faced quite a few protests. You can't do anything in this field when you're dealing with some of the most deadly substances on Earth without having transparency, public attention, dialogue, consensus building, everything we've talked about in many of the public health meetings this week. It's been a very, very challenging process. And if any of you read Russian, the sign on the left there says something to the effect of, without any community support and involvement, there'll be no factory, no facility here at all. And then on the right, one of the, I think personally, a mistake made in the US program was we secretly began shipping a neutralized VX nerve agent from Indiana to Texas to be burned in Port Arthur, Texas, just outside of Houston. And it's a very poor black community, so it raised all sorts of environmental justice issues, and no one had agreed to this at all. And yet all of the toxic liquid waste from the VX neutralization process went down to Texas and was burned there eventually. I'd also raise the issue of buried chemical weapons. A lot of people never want to really talk about this, but all of the warring powers of the last century not only stockpiled weapons, but most of them got rid of them by the time the Chemical Weapons Convention came into force. So we only had 8 countries, as I've said, declare stockpiles. Where did it all go? The Americans, the Russians, Australians, others had very large stockpiles, either of their own weapons or of allied weapons. And a lot of these were just buried, basically, dumped and buried. And so the only real statistics we have on this is the United States has been pretty transparent on this and written a report over 20 years ago that identifies 224 suspected burial sites in 96 locations in 38 states, including the Virgin Islands and the District of Columbia. And we've been working on the burial site in downtown Washington, D.C. for 23 years now. And that's another story. I'll come to that in the next slide. We also have over 700 former military sites, what we call FUDs, which require, quote, further investigation for buried chemical munitions. We don't have data on other countries at all. The Russians refuse to talk about this. You have buried chemical weapon sites in Australia. I think Bob probably knows more about this than a lot more than I do. And that's a picture of downtown Spring Valley in Washington, D.C. Those of you who know Washington, D.C., the real research laboratory for the United States in World War I was in Northwest Washington at American University. And so today, 100 years later, after the research lab was closed, they've begun an excavation program and a survey program. And this is a very built-up, high, as we say, high-rent area today with beautiful homes where ambassadors and congressmen and senators live. And really, it's been an enormous effort, well over $300 million spent. And I can talk more about that later if you like. So the other major item I'd mention is sea-dumped chemical weapons. Unfortunately, up until probably 30 or 40 years ago, most countries dumped all their weapons at sea. And so we're left today with these enormous dump sites all over the world. You see in these numbers here, at least something like 21,000 tons estimated off of Australia, the Australian coast. I think mostly actually the east coast here, if I'm not mistaken. We have 29,000 metric tons off the western east coast of the United States, including all around Hawaii as well. And then Japan has been dealing with this a lot. 40,000 tons in the Baltic, which is probably the most shallow dump sites, and this is a growing problem that we still don't have much scientific evidence on. Conclusions. I'll zip through probably about a dozen bullets here. Chemical agents are no longer viable military weapons, have become taboo, morally reprehensible, and a dangerous burden to everybody. Russia's made excellent progress in safely eliminating 94%, and the Russian and U.S. programs have been plagued, though, with cost overruns, schedule delays, but we can see the horizon now in the next 3 to 6 years. Russia's been reluctant to be totally transparent, particularly since we left Russia. We were kicked out of Russia more or less about 6 years ago. As soon as many of these facilities began operating, they kicked the Green Cross out of Russia, they kicked the Global Partnership out, they kicked, as you know, the Peace Corps and USAID and really everybody out of the country. But the Russian program has made, I think, still very good progress. It's just not very transparent. The Indian program, I noted, was not transparent at all, and the South Korean program was a top secret program. Today, Green Cross operates no local regional outreach offices in Russia, unfortunately. But expectations are that Russia will complete its program in 2020, which is a good news story. 4 remaining non-member countries need to join the Chemical Weapons Convention. We continue to press these countries, Egypt, Israel, North Korea, and South Sudan. One of the key issues in the whole North Korean growing crisis around missile testing and nuclear weapons testing is the Koreans have probably over 5,000 tons all deployed in artillery shells aimed at Seoul, South Korea. And if there's any sort of military action in North Korea, we all have to realize that there'll probably be tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people killed in Seoul, South Korea immediately, not with nuclear weapons, but with chemical weapons, which will make the Syrian situation today look like a birthday party. All CWC states parties must fulfill their national obligations under the treaty, including annual trade reporting. I think Dr. Matthews may talk about the Australia group a bit on that, and implementation of a national authority. And fortunately, the Nobel Peace Prize, as some of you may know, was given to the OPSW in 2013, which has been a very strong confidence-building measure, partly because of the Syrian situation, but also largely because of their long-term 20-year work on abolishing a whole class of weapons of mass destruction. Protection of the environment, public health, worker safety, in weapons demilitarization in general, not just chemical weapons, is a major absolute necessity, trumping deadlines and budget limits. And I can't emphasize this enough. In working in this field with a lot of Defense Department, military colleagues, and foreign ministry colleagues, and civil engineers and chemical engineers and the like, oftentimes some of them have a bit of a narrow vision, is a polite way to say it, and look at deadlines and cost efficiencies as priority, and not necessarily protection of public health and the environment and worker safety. So we continually hammer away at that. It's like bumper stickers that we use over time. Second bullet here, transparency, stakeholder involvement, public dialogue, consensus building are essential to program success. This is one of the sustainable development goals. The first bullet is as well, and I know all of us in our different programs here hammer away at this. Abolition of a whole class of weapons of mass destruction is really an historic achievement, and I'm happy we can raise this here today at this excellent conference. The recent alleged nerve agent attacks in Syria must be widely condemned, and the OPCW fact-finding mission, what we call the FFM, engaged immediately to determine facts and forensic evidence, and I'm happy to answer more questions on this if you'd like. Perpetrators of these attacks must be brought to justice as war criminals, and the ongoing use of chemical weapons halted in Syria. And I'll stop there on a negative note, unfortunately. With that, I know I went a little bit over time, but I know we still have plenty of time, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Matthews to carry the ball now. Thank you very much for your attention.